give me your experience, like the first time you are out, you're out there on the golf course. It's your first time playing golf. How was that experience? How terrible were you? Has your has your handicap improved?
I don't have a handicap, but my first time on the golf course was with my husband and his family. And yeah, it was a bit of a disaster. It looks really easy when you're watching other people doing it. So I figured, I can do this. I missed the ball quite a few times. But yeah, with time, I've gotten better. I actually went for some lessons with a pro golfer. We used to live in Kenya, so I went for some lessons with her. And actually, I went for the lessons secretly. So I decided that the next time I'm on the golf course with these guys, I'm just going to shock them. And yeah, so the next time I'm on the golf course, my husband was like, what's going on here?
And like, what are some of the key lessons that you learned from just like from being on a golf course? Like, what
Yeah.
what are some of the life lessons that you learned being on the golf course?
I love golf, and my kids play golf, and I love them playing it because I think golf is a mental game. So many lessons to learn, but perhaps I can give you three. So the first is no matter how badly you start, you can always get better. And I think that's such a great lesson for life that you may not quite get out the blocks running. Sometimes you stumble out of the blocks, but if you just keep at it, if you're persistent, you will get better. And golf's like that. You just have to keep going. Sometimes you're having a bad golf day. Recently, I posted on social media about the fact that we'd gone out to play golf with my family. So I have two boys, so my husband and the two boys, and I had a terrible start. And it's because I hadn't been on the golf course for, I think, over a year. Each time when they go, I usually beg off and tell them, nah, you guys go along. And it was terrible. I actually almost quit, but I realized that, my quitting wouldn't be a very good, role modeling for the boys. So I persisted and I got better. And I actually managed to hit some really good shots. So the first is, persistence pays. And I think you learn that on the golf course. The second thing you learn on the golf course is humility, because the golf course can
Yeah,
humble
we'll humble
you.
you. Try to say that. Yeah.
Even if you're really great, you can have a bad day. And I think the golf course teaches you humility and how to still persist. And I guess that's back to the persistence, to be honest.
All right. Cool.
Yeah, and then it's just about pushing through. Yeah, because it's a mental game, I think.
All right, cool. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another exciting episode of The Bold Exchange. I would like to appreciate everyone who's watching us, whether you are stuck at the job you hate and you're using your company Wi-Fi to watch this show. We really appreciate you. Whether you are having financial problems, don't worry, it'll get better. We appreciate you. Today, I'm joined by an amazing woman. She is an award-winning emotional intelligence practitioner, a facilitator, a Ntoni, Mucha Mlingo, right? Yeah, at least I pronounced that right.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm hoping to have a very, very, very bold exchange with you. From where I come from, right? Like the era that I grew up in and the year that I was born. I tend to always then, like when we were growing up, we had people saying, "You guys are soft," and then I also tend to think that those guys who are coming after us are a bit soft.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the current generation is too sensitive and soft?
You know what? It's a tough question. I think they are. They're definitely, well, definitely is a strong word, but generally speaking, they're not as resilient. And I think it's because life has been softer for them for the most part, right? They have parents who, our parents used to tell us how they used to walk to school. I don't know if you had parents like that. They'll tell you how they walked for like an hour to school and all that kind of thing. And so their experiences made them resilient, made them tough. And I think generally speaking, most parents want to ensure that the next generation, their kids, don't go through what they went through. So they're a little softer. They're not as, strict. You don't go through as many experiences. And I think with generations, there is that element of softness because we're trying to, make sure that our kids don't go through some of the stuff that we went through, right? Some of the hard knocks that we experienced. So there's an element that is soft. But equally, if I look at, Zimbabwe, for example, Zimbabwe has gone through some changes. When I look at Zimbabwe when I was growing up, Zimbabwe was softer. when I was growing up. So I think in some elements, they are a bit more resilient, a little harder because they're growing up in a very different economy where, every day you're really trying to figure out how to make things work. And I think that's the case across the continent. So to some extent, yes, I think they are. As the generations go, guys have gotten a little softer. And I think a lot of it is because parents intentionally feel like, I went through all this stuff so that my kids don't have to. And that's what happens generation after generation.
So, with me, like when I was actually like just going through your profile and everything, like me, the only EQ I know is the one when I'm trying to actually stabilize my base and actually. So just for the viewers out there, can you let us know what is it that you actually do and what's how important is emotional intelligence?
All right. So let's start perhaps with the definition of what emotional intelligence is. If you go online and you look at a dictionary, it will tell you it's about being able to tune in to your emotions, so pay attention to what you're feeling, to be able to use that information appropriately, right? So that you can navigate through life successfully. And that's really what emotional intelligence is. It's also about being able to tune into what others are feeling so that you can understand what lies beneath the surface. So that sounds really complicated. Simply put, emotional intelligence is being smart with your feelings. It's recognizing that your feelings are important and they are useful. Your feelings are data, and you need to use that data appropriately. That's really what it is in a nutshell.
So me crying when Jake wakes up, Asna Umugababa and Rose on Titanic is emotional intelligence.
Not necessarily. So the fact that you've maybe tuned into what you're feeling, that is EQ. But remember, EQ is also about using it appropriately. Now, okay, one could argue about how appropriate it is to cry in that scenario. But the idea is it's not about being emotional. Sometimes we mix that up. It's about tuning in. This is what I feel. Emotions are data, but emotions are not directives. Just because I feel a certain way doesn't necessarily mean I should act that way, right? Someone may annoy me in the workplace. It doesn't mean that I can slap them because I feel like slapping them, right? So EQ is about tuning in, noticing, okay, this is how I feel, but making a determination that, okay, as much as I feel this way, this is not the most appropriate way to act, and so I will, act differently. It's different to people who then aren't paying attention, who are working on autopilot, right? Because our emotions drive our behavior, and that's biological. The emotional part of the brain is the one that triggers action. And so when we're not paying attention, our emotions are influencing us without us realizing.
My producer has a friend like that who's like emotionally tone deaf. So he knows him. I could have said his name, but he's still got business going on with him. But so let's talk about emotional intelligence in the workplace and in the leadership space, because I'm sure you've probably done workshops with different firms, different companies. What are some of the challenges that companies are facing when it comes to emotional intelligence in leadership and in the employees?
Yeah. I think for the longest time, we've believed in the lie that says, when we come to work, leave your emotions at the door. My emotions are an integral part of who I am. I can't leave them anywhere. They are with me everywhere I go. And so what happens is, in the workplace, we've been taught to suppress what we're feeling. Now, it doesn't mean that when we're saying be emotionally intelligent, that we must now burst into tears at work. That's not what we're talking about. Remember, emotional intelligence is about tuning in, but navigating appropriately, right? But when it comes to work, the challenge we're having is that people are expected to operate without their emotions, which is not possible.
But I mean, my supervisor can actually then look at me and say, listen, guy, this is a cash transaction. I didn't come here to babysit you or to nurse you. If you want your emotions, go see a therapist or someone out there. We're here just for a transaction. How do we navigate those kind of situations? And
so that supervisor will be very short-sighted, because the research shows that when people feel better, they do better. Bottom line results. We're not talking about airy-fairy things. We're not talking about things that are just nice to have. We're talking about dollars in the bank. Organizations where individuals feel better, as in, I like coming to work, as in, when I come to work, I feel positive about it. They do better financially, bottom line, in terms of their performance. People perform better when they're feeling better. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything in my workplace. It doesn't mean that I like everything in my workplace. When you think of a climate, right? Climate is the general weather pattern. It's not the daily weather. So climate in Zimbabwe, today it's sunny, maybe tomorrow it rained, the next day it's a little cold. But we would say the general climate is temperate, right? Likewise, workplaces where the climate is positive do better. So a supervisor who comes with that idea that, hey, this is a business transaction, is not going to get the best out of their team. They really won't. You get the best out of your team when, as a leader, you're able to cultivate what we call psychological safety. This idea where people come and they feel good about being in work. When people feel good, they do better. And that is, the research shows this over and over again. And so supervisors I work with and leaders I work with, I help them to understand how to create this environment. Now, EQ is not about being soft. So sometimes leaders get worried that, no, but if I'm nice all the time, guys will take advantage. EQ is not about being nice. Leaders who are high in emotional intelligence know how to hold people accountable. They know how to set boundaries. They know how to drive performance. It's just the how. It's how you talk to people. It's how you interact with them. It's being intentional about getting to know the people you work with, understand what they're going through so that you can provide the support they need. And what that does is it helps them, even from a mental health perspective, to just have a better mental health. And in that case, you get better results.
You mentioned something very interesting. You mentioned boundaries in what you're saying, and you're big on boundaries in the workplace. What are boundaries, and how do we define boundaries? Because in boundary, anongozia boundary. Like what are boundaries in the workplace, and how, and then how do they navigate without walking on eggshells? Say, am I pushing a boundary here?
So boundaries in the workplace is just really, what we're willing to accept. Ultimately, it's what we're willing to accept, right? So boundaries run from how people talk to you, right? So, for example, one boundary is I will not be shouted at in the workplace. So if you're shouting, my comment to you will be, I think maybe you need to take a breather, and when you're ready to talk in a civil manner, we can continue this conversation. I'm not willing to have someone shout at me, right? The last time I was shouted at was when I was a child by my father. I'm not accepting that right now in my life. So something like that is a boundary. Boundaries also mean, working hours, for example, right? There are people who really safeguard their working hour boundary. And they say, when I leave at 5, I'm done. I'm not taking calls. I'm not responding to emails. I mean, I know we all work in different places, right? I'm just giving examples of boundaries. So there are some work environments where 5 finish is not possible. Boundaries are, I don't work over the weekend, or I don't take calls over the weekend. Boundaries could be around what's appropriate in terms of how we interact with each other. What's appropriate in terms of, physical contact, right? So I may have a boundary where I don't like being touched. So when you're engaging with me, don't put your hand on my shoulder, for example. So how do we establish those boundaries? I think that as an individual, first of all, you have to understand what your boundaries are. So where are those lines that you want to draw in the sand? What are some of the things that you're not comfortable with? What are some of the things that are really important to you? So one of the things I always say is that emotional intelligence begins with self-awareness. It begins with you understanding yourself. And so for each individual, you'd have to really think through what are those things that I hold dear. And then when I know them, how can I express those boundaries in such a way that I'm still respectful, I let people know what's okay for me and what's not okay.
Is it emotionally intelligent to have a work husband or a work wife? And what are some of the crazy situations that you've encountered and problems that you've solved when it comes to just working in different companies? Like, what are some of the issues? What are some of the most prevalent issues that to do with like emotional intelligence with the workplace?
So to your first question about having a work husband, I mean, I think it's a term that we loosely coin, right? And I think it comes down to, what's the behavior between you. And again, your boundaries. Each person determines their own boundaries, right? So that depends on the individual. And then in terms of the things that come up in work, I think many of us don't know how to resolve conflict. So conflict resolution is a big one in workplaces. So you find teams that are not working well together. There's things that are unsaid that should be said. I've worked with teams where there's serious tension. You can actually cut it with a knife when you engage with them. And it's because things are not being said. So you've encroached a boundary of mine and I've not told you that I'm not happy with that. And so I keep it inside, it builds up, and now it affects even the way we communicate. It affects the emails. There's an undertone in the emails. So I think conflict resolution is a big one. Some of the other work we've done is around team dynamics, helping people to work together more effectively. You know, we're different. And so our differences can cause us to rub against each other. And so in teams, we have to learn how to value diversity and recognize that our differences are actually what make us stronger as a team. If we all thought the same way, we would not be as effective. And then I think maybe a third kind of broad thematic area where we work is with leaders. Most organizations promote people on the basis of their technical capacity, but what makes you great technically doesn't necessarily make you great as a leader. So you could be great behind the camera, right? So you're really great, you are an amazing videographer, you know how to pick out the lighting and everything. But leading a team of videographers and photographers is very different. And many of us just don't have we've never developed, I shouldn't say we don't have, we've never developed, we've never been intentional about building the capacity to lead. And so we just lead anyhow, or we lead how we like to be led, which is not necessarily how the team needs to be led. And so a lot of work we've done is around helping leaders to understand that they need to actually build the capacity of leadership. Leadership is a skill, right? It's something that you have to develop. So the same effort you make when you go to university and you get a degree and you do your master's and you do all these professional certifications for your technical skill, those are the same, efforts that we need to make to build our capacity as leaders. So I think leadership is one area that in many organizations we're actually in crisis. I was having a conversation with someone recently about something that's going on in their organization. And as I'm listening, I'm just thinking that's a leadership crisis. The leader doesn't know how to lead effectively and cultivate that psychological safety I talked about earlier.
So you primary school, you used to write your homework and underline. It's like the way you were so well spoken. You keep give me a bit of context, where does Mucha come from? What's going on in your early life, and how then do you gravitate towards emotional intelligence and and being were you prefect?
No, I wasn't actually.
Group leader, class monitor?
Class monitor at some point. I was a bit of a teacher's pet, yes.
Right.
Definitely. One of those kids that sat in the front, like you said.
Underlined their homework?
Underlined homework, yeah. Used highlighters. Yeah, I was one of those growing up. I actually always wanted to be an engineer. And I actually went to university and did a year of engineering. And I hated it. So I love math. Math's my favorite subject, always was through school. And when I was in high school, I liked physics. So I figured physics, maths, engineering. And I always tell the story. I have a sister younger than me, and then I have a stepsister older than me. And due to life circumstances, we all actually started university at the same time. And we all went to do engineering. And I sucked at it. I hated it. I used to go to lectures, and it felt like they were speaking in a foreign language. I was just like, oh my goodness, now what do I do? End of the year, I realized that I could not continue. I really was miserable. And so I dropped that. And then I didn't know what to do. I was like clueless because I wanted to do engineering forever. My sisters were doing engineering. They were thriving. I just felt like such a failure. And so I just decided to go back to maths, my first love. So my first degree is in mathematics. But when I finished, I knew I did not want to be a teacher. So I studied in the UK and UK schools. I was just like, there's no way. I will kill those children. So I really was a bit clueless about what to do. I decided to do a master's because I had no other idea. I did a master's in finance and I worked in financial services. So my early career worked bank, insurance company, and then for a financial services company. And, it was okay, but it wasn't the thing. It wasn't that thing. And, I always say that I think God had mercy on me. He realized that if I leave this child, she'll never figure it out. So my last job before I found the job, I hated it. I was working for a bank in sales and I was miserable. Back then I never knew about depression. I don't know, to be fair, if I'd heard about it, I probably thought it was kind of white people stuff, right? But looking back, I realized I was sliding into depression. I hated my job. And one day I just decided to quit. I was just like, I can't. And I remember my friends at the bank saying, but you don't have another job. What will you do? I was like, you know what? I'll go back home. I went home, stayed with my mom, and did temp work. And as I was doing temp work, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, what kind of job I wanted, I got a call from a recruiter who said, hey, we've seen your CV. Back then, there used to be this website called Monster. I don't know if it still exists. And I'd uploaded my CV. We got this, I saw your CV online. I've got this role. I don't know if you're interested. So I thought, what's the role? And it was in financial services, but in their training department. And, I always say that I got a job that I never applied for, that technically I wasn't qualified for. I'd never done training before. And when I started that job, I remember telling my boss then, oh my goodness, I was born to do this. I love training. And I think the challenge is when I finished uni, in my head, I was thinking of teaching kids.
Right.
I never imagined that you could teach grown-ups, right? And so, I worked for a financial services company, training our financial advisors and stockbrokers, and I fell in love. I loved my job. It was so much fun. Every day was fun. I mean, the reality about work is there's things about your job that you don't particularly like, but I loved that job. Then I got married, and soon after we got married, my husband got a job in Nairobi, in Cape Town. So I left my job, moved to Nairobi, and I could not get work that was similar. So in the UK, the financial services industry is very, regulated. And so my role, I was a technical trainer. So I prepared our financial advisors and stockbrokers for the exams they needed to do. And there wasn't anything similar in Nairobi. So I was home for a bit. And then a random conversation with a friend I'd made at church made me realize that, you know what? Some of these training skills are transferable. So I don't have to train on technical stuff. I can train on soft skills. And before you knew it, that's what I was doing.
Let's track back. Nokuti tifambe tione kuti emotional intelligence yakuguida sei. So like looking back, say in your early 20s or like in your late teens, looking back, is there a certain scenario or certain situation where you think, well, I could have been more emotionally intelligent at that part, and part of that relationship didn't work out? Is there not relationship with a guy, I mean relationship with a friend?
Yeah.
Is this? Do you have a story like that that you then see? Oh well, I wasn't emotionally intelligent, or that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a number of things that come to mind. I think that, when I was 16, my parents got divorced. And that was a troubling time. And that's when I moved to the UK, actually, to go and do my A-levels. And I think that knowing what I know now, I definitely could have navigated that a lot more. And just, so one of the things I've learned about myself now is because of that period and the feeling of being very out of control of my life because of what went on at that time, I now know that I have an overriding need for control, right? And I think for me, had I been able to just spend some time really unpacking what I was feeling through that period, I think it would have suited me a lot better. It would have helped me to make some better decisions. I think I definitely was a lot more kind of closed off. So, above the surface, there's this face of Mucha that you see, but deep down inside, there's a different, right? So I'd become very good at putting on a face, if I can put it that way, and really hiding what I'm really feeling. And that's because of, what went on with my parents. I think that's definitely something that if I had the knowledge I have now, I would have been a little kinder to myself and helped myself to understand that even those feelings that make you feel uncomfortable, it's important to acknowledge them. It's important to allow them to come to the surface. It's important for you to feel the feels. I have a tendency, and this is something I'm trying to unlearn now, to want to just kind of push aside what I'm feeling because it's uncomfortable, right? And I look back and I see it's rooted in what I navigated when I was younger, and I see it throughout, as you said, into my kind of going to uni, early 20s, later. Very much this idea that I sometimes wear a mask. So there's this face, that I'm putting on. All is well. Everything is going great. But deep down inside, there's like a lot going on. There's a lot of churning things. And the problem with that is, there's multiple problems. One of the problems with that is people don't get to know you deeply. They know you at the surface because the surface is all you're showing. And so you end up with a lot of very superficial relationships.
No, but I understand also, and it's like when you speak about that, like of you having to wear a mask, it's like you're always worried as a shell to protect you.
Yes, because you don't want to get hurt.
Vulnerability, and 100%. Then I totally
100%, yeah.
Totally can relate to that. Do you usually take your work home, like, and emotionally rational
yeah.
Do you take your work home and then you psychoanalyze your spouse or your kids, and you're like,
so the way you say it, psychoanalyze, makes it sound so bad.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying, like, do you take your work at home sometimes?
Yeah, I do, and sometimes I do intentionally, right? Because one of the things I, tell myself is I can't be telling people out there about emotional intelligence and I'm not practicing it at home. I love to tell the story of how my kids told me one time that I shout too much. And, fortunately, they caught me in one of those EQ moments where I was open to feedback, because that's one of the tenets of emotional intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Being able to hear what people say and not get emotional about it. And so, my initial response was, yeah, it's because you guys, make me shout. But, I was able in that moment to stop and think and really hear them. And so I went on a journey of, trying to kind of pause. And so I call myself a recovering shoutaholic, right? So that's one of the things I've taken home, this idea that I need to stop and pause. I have 2 boys, and, growing up, they really just know how to push your buttons.
No, trust me, I've got 2 nieces as well. Then, speaking of kids and emotional intelligence, right?
Yeah.
And what do you feel like? Okay, should emotional intelligence be actually included in our curriculum?
100%.
Should it be taught in schools?
I think
and
it should.
Let's.
I 100% think it should. The reality is, and I think more so today, the children we're raising them to live in a world that will have changed by the time they arrive in it, right? The rate of change is rapidly accelerating. I was reflecting. I'll give.
Sorry, can you play that? You said the raising kids.
We're raising kids for a world that ultimately doesn't exist. Like, the world they are preparing for will have changed by the time they arrive there. And the rate of change is rapidly accelerating. It's really fast. Jobs that exist today did not exist before.
True.
I have a social media manager who I think I pay a lot of money. That's a job that didn't exist before, right? And it's such a critical job now. And there are jobs that our children are preparing for that don't exist. So this maths and English we are teaching them, it's great, but it may not be enough for them when they hit the workplace. Emotional intelligence is so critical because it's about them. EQ is about knowing yourself, right? Remember, we said it's about paying attention. It's about knowing yourself. It's about knowing yourself beneath the surface, not just that surface knowing yourself.
Yeah.
It's knowing yourself down to, who you really are when there's no one else.
Yeah.
What your triggers are, what your defaults are. It's knowing yourself at that level. And that's so critical. It's also about being intentional about how you show up. So remember, I said paying attention to your emotions, but then being intentional about how you use them. Emotional intelligence is about adaptability. It's about resilience. It's about being able to navigate conflict appropriately. It's about being able to communicate appropriately. Those are the skills that our kids will need for life in the future. Way more than knowing that 1 + 1 = 2. Now, I'm not saying that's not important. Of course it is. But I think that we really do need to invest in helping our children to understand themselves, to be able to understand the world around them. Another element of emotional intelligence is being able to read the room. How important is that, to go into a meeting and read the room, to engage with a customer and read the room and know that, okay, this customer looks really annoyed. Before I jump into my sales pitch, let me stop and check in to see what's going on. Because you'll jump into your sales pitch oblivious, the customer says no, not because they were not interested in your product, but because you haven't dealt with an issue, maybe an experience they had with the receptionist as they were coming in. But if you don't have that EQ to be able to pick up on emotions, you miss all of that. Those are critical skills, I believe.
And do you feel like still on the raising the children, do you feel like we were over-parented and this current generation is being under-parented?
I think there's a mix of parenting styles because, we have a lot of helicopter parents who are really like, 24/7 managing their children's schedules, and their children go, from school to extra lessons in ballet to the golf course to the swimming pool. You know what I mean? So we have parents on that extreme. Yes, to an organized play date, right? So we have parents on that extreme, whereas we were told to entertain ourselves. And then not panze, right? And there was no one entertaining you. But the flip side is, I think, as we've gotten more affluent, as we're growing, as, kind of in the middle class and we're chasing the almighty dollar, I do think that on the flip side, we have a lot of kids who are literally raising themselves because we're so busy. We're busy, working all hours, we're traveling all hours, and the kids are being raised by the maid. So I think, do you know what I mean? It's like we've got two extremes, I think, of kind of parenting styles.
And you've been in Zim, Kenya, Europe, right? And when you then, like, if you were to then put all these people that you've interacted in all these different countries and we weigh emotional intelligence, which ones are the worst and which ones are like a bit more?
Oh, that's a good question. So now I'm actually based in SA, so that's another dimension. I don't know that you can really say that, a country is. I mean, I think so emotional intelligence is made up of a number of things. I mean, I've very broadly categorized it. We can categorize it into three. So it's about self-awareness, right? It's about self-management, being able to manage your emotions appropriately. And then it's about, what we call self-direction, right? So that's about your motivation and your drive and you're pushing yourself. So that's the three areas broadly. Now, these three areas break into more competencies. And when we measure emotional intelligence, we use a tool that measures 8 different competencies. So I suspect you will find that some regions, some of the competencies, come more readily to them, and other regions, some of different competencies come up. So, for example, empathy is one of the things that we measure in emotional intelligence. And I suspect that, if you're looking across the African continent, and I'm generalizing, you find that empathy is something that maybe is more prevalent, only because, we've been raised to be more aware of others. Culturally, we are raised to think about others. Whereas you find in the kind of Western culture, they're raised more to kind of think about themselves and maybe just their immediate circle. When you're raised in an environment where you have cousins and cousins who are now your cousins, I think this idea of empathy, yes, it's, what I mean. So you probably find that there's competencies of emotional intelligence that in the different regions are stronger. But I don't think you can say that one region is more emotionally intelligent as a whole.
And then, there's something that you always advocate for and that you're a big fan of, and that's critical thinking. Do you feel like we as Africans, or as Zimbabweans, do you feel like we are good critical thinkers in general?
I think that we are, in general. I think that we are. And the reason why I say that is because, I think the circumstances of life, and I think this is true across the continent, but speaking about Zimbabwe, generally mean that you do have to be able to really weigh up different options, right? Life isn't so linear and straight and easy. And so that brings about some element of critical thinking. Our education system generally also was quite broad. I mean, to be fair, I went to school a very long time ago, and my children aren't necessarily in school in Zimbabwe. But what I see about our education system is that, unlike a lot of African countries where I've lived, where the focus is like 99% on academics, Zimbabwean education is actually quite broad. And this is not just in the private schools. skills. I think even in the schools that are government schools that are, not necessarily in urban areas, our education system is quite broad, right? You're learning more than just bookwork, which is a great, which is something that really feeds into being able to think critically, right? Because your brain has been exposed to different things. And at the heart of critical thinking is creativity. So you're exposed to the different things, and so you're curious about different things. So I would say generally, our education system has allowed us to be critical thinkers. But like I said, this is a generalization. I wouldn't say then that every Zimbabwean is. But I think our education system, our circumstances have created an environment where, critical thinking is something I think that we do fairly well.
SA, Zimbabwe, Kenya, South Africans, Zimbabweans, Kenyans. Who deals with the truth a bit better?
Interesting question. I think it would be hard for me to speak to South Africa because I'm relatively new in South Africa. I think an environment I know well is Kenya. So when you ask who deals with the truth, what context?
Who deals with the truth better is in accepting, whether we're just in conversation, in generalization, in cultures, in upbringing.
What I found about Kenya that's interesting is that Kenyans are very similar. Now, to be fair, Kenya has very many tribes. So again, this is a generalization because from one tribe to another, there's marked differences. But if you were to put Kenyans together generally, and I think this is why Zimbabweans do so well in Kenya, there's a lot of similarities with us. So I don't think it would be easy to say this one better than this one. I think in some things, Kenyans are maybe more vocal about it than Zimbabweans. Definitely, if you look at the political landscape, for example, Kenyans, and especially more recently, are definitely a lot more vocal about what they're seeing and speak freely about what they're seeing. But in terms of accepting the truth, that's a good question. I'm not sure that there's a marked difference between, and for me, I'd speak more comfortably about Kenyans and Zimbabweans because I'm relatively new in South Africa, so I wouldn't really speak with confidence about South Africans. And I would say, I don't think there's a marked difference for me between Kenyans and Zimbabweans.
And when you go online, Twitter, are you on Twitter?
Yes,
you are
am.
on Twitter.
Yes, I am.
And when you go online,
and
like when I go online, it's amazing how it's a crazy, it's an ocean. Like when you go online, what's your analysis of that whole space? The hate, the good, the bad, the evil. Like, what's your analysis of the current, just cyberspace when we talk of emotional intelligence?
I think online has been phenomenal in the sense that it has just provided such an amazing platform for individuals to express themselves. And that's both in terms of your personal views and in terms of, if you want to grow your brand as a business, right? So I think what online has done, and if I think of myself as a brand, perhaps, or my business, online has given us what would have taken years to do if we were using the traditional methods of getting our message out there. So I think it's a phenomenal space. But with all phenomenal things, right, there's a lot of, there's some negative sides. So one of the downsides of online is that people tend to say things that they would never say to you
in your face,
right? People feel freer to say. And so there's a lot more kind of hate speech. We know that there's rising incidences of cyberbullying. And I think from an emotional intelligence perspective, I think people act without EQ online. They really do. There's some freedom that comes when you're speaking.
With the Cupid.
Say things that you would never say to someone else, right? You just say them. And that anonymity, the idea that, it's not like someone's coming to my house and they will know it was me, has given people, the space to say things they would never say. So I think a lot of people act without emotional intelligence. One of the things that I'm trying to do with my kids, I have a 16-year-old who's, wading in that water, is to just really help to just those three things I talked about. Being more self-aware. So kind of really tuning in, paying attention to how you're feeling and how what you're feeling might impact what you will say online. Excuse me.
So
something went down the wrong way, but also about self-management. Sometimes take a pause before you post and ask yourself, would I really say that, face to face? And just really, emotional intelligence is so important when you're interacting online, I think.
and and do you feel like there's a generation, of, especially in like our families, that will never get it because and like I'm very glad that you're here because I've been wanting to like really have this conversation with someone. Like, is it in our families? Do you think that there will be people who won't even get it because you'll find, Kuti, let's say, you're slicing veggies, and then someone has been married for 6 years.
Yeah.
Utonza umwe munhu hama yake ichitosvika saka hamusitoda kuita vana, or someone like the one I get the most is saka murora ari kupi kana ucharora rini, you know what I mean? And then when you then give them the response they want, you might come off as rude and stuff. Do you feel like we as in our African context and setup, there's space for emotional intelligence or
I think there is space for emotional intelligence, and to be honest with you, it's not even cultural. If you use that example, especially Yekuti vana asking, usually that would be the tetes, and the tetes, it's out of a relationship with you. It's not a random stranger coming and asking. That's not cultural. That's bad manners that we've picked up, right? Because you don't know what people are going through. Maybe someone's trying and they can't get pregnant, right? And you're poking that wound. Maybe someone's had a miscarriage. That's not cultural. Culturally, the tetes, tete is such a, well, at least in the Shona culture, such an important person in your life. But tete is someone you have a relationship with. So when tete is laughing with you, we have a relationship, so we can laugh about it together. And the odds are, tete knows my struggles because I've told her. So she knows, and she wouldn't be inappropriate about how she asks. She would never ask me in public because Tete probably knows because we have a relationship. There's a big difference when some of these uncomfortable topics are asked by someone you have a relationship with to someone who just thinks they can ask. And so those behaviors, we use the excuse that it's cultural, that Pachivanu, we feel that we can just be, but it's not cultural. It's just bad manners that people have picked up. And yes, unfortunately, there are those people who just will always have those bad manners. They just haven't understood. And it goes back to this idea of not being able to read the room, right? Because you find Munosha will ask you, if you are paying attention, you will see that you've poked or you've said something that's made someone uncomfortable. But because they're so oblivious, they keep persisting. You know what I mean? They keep asking. And yet, if you were able to read the room, at least the first thing you would ask, and then you realize, okay, maybe this is a sore topic. Let me segue off. So, yeah, unfortunately, there always will be those who are clueless.
So the fact that that our EQ is actually embedded in most of our culture, can we then try use our traditions to actually try teach emotional intelligence?
Yeah, why not?
As we move along.
Not? I think that one of the challenges we have, so I think generally as people, what happens is we navigate our upbringing, right? And then, especially thinking from a parenting perspective, right? So you look at someone who say, in Dagaro, I was beaten for no reason. If I looked at my parents funny, they'd beat me up, right? And so the challenge we have is we then say, because in Dagaro, I will not hit my children, right? So what we do is we swing the pendulum the other direction. There are elements of our culture that may be troublesome. There are elements of our culture that maybe growing up you felt like, I really didn't appreciate this. Maybe you felt like, you were looked down upon as a girl or whatever it was. But now we swing the other direction and we say all of it must be thrown away. But that's not true. There are so many elements of our culture that are so rich and yes, that are embedded with elements of EQ that we can utilize as we parent, 100%.
So say you as a professional, say the government of Zimbabwe actually then engages you and says, well, we want our people to think more critically and to be more empathetical. And what steps would you suggest and what would you recommend just?
Yeah. I think for me, emotional intelligence starts with self-awareness. I think if you are looking at where to start, it's just helping people to recognize that your emotions impact your behavior. So how do we pay attention to our emotions? I think even earlier we're talking about building this into the curriculum. if that was all we did, you would be amazed at the impact it would have. When I am aware of how I'm feeling, when I'm aware of how what I'm feeling impacts my behavior, how it impacts my behavior, how it impacts those around me. If I can start there by helping us to just be more self-aware, I think that will go a long way, because you can't manage what you don't know. So we can't say, let's, build self-management, because what we'll end up doing is we'll end up just teaching this idea of shutting things down or, pushing things away, which is not emotional intelligence. So for me, I think it will be starting with developing self-awareness. How can you, get off autopilot? The brain loves autopilot. It's the way the brain is created. And it makes sense because the brain has a million things that it's doing. And so it will prefer to do as many of them as possible without thinking about it.
It has to go on AI. It'll be on.
But the danger with autopilot, it means you're not paying attention.
True.
Yeah. And so for me, I think the work would be around, a campaign around just being self-aware. Just stop and pay attention. And you'll be amazed at the impact paying attention would make. It would mean that when we're communicating with each other, we communicate differently, because I've tuned in and realized, okay, I'm getting annoyed. And my annoyance is now spilling over into the tone of voice and into the words I'm using. So maybe I need to take a break. Maybe let me take a walk. Maybe let's have this conversation later. It would impact how we discipline our children, right? It would impact how we lead our teams if we were more self-aware. It would impact how we drive on the streets of...
Yeah, but driving. Speaking of driving, right? Speaking of driving and how we even just interact with ourselves. I use this... I could have said your guys' names, but because you still got my fan, I'll just, just even the customer service space, especially in banks, whether you're passport offices and stuff like that. How do we then build these teams, and how can we train, and what would you suggest on how to train those people to actually even have the emotional intelligence to treat people with, no, listen, your salary, I'm not the one who's paying it. It's being paid by your boss. Negotiate with your boss. Don't take it out on me. Like, how would we, how can we navigate that space?
I think that the only way to really do that is to support people in teams to have ownership, right? The way someone serves customers when they feel as though I'm just at work, this is someone else's thing, is very different to the way people serve customers when they feel ownership, when there's this idea that, I am an integral part of the process for this particular organization. And so I think that service, that customer service and helping teams to do that better, it starts with, the individual's experience. There's no amazing customer experience if there's no amazing employee experience. Employees really just dish out what they get. And so if organizations truly want to transform how employees interact with customers, they need to start internally. This is why I tell you self-awareness is everything, right? So even self-awareness as an organization. So this requires leaders thinking through, how are we creating an environment? Remember what I said earlier, when people feel good, they do good. How are we creating an environment? And here's the thing, it's not always just about salary. How are we creating an environment, where people feel they are part of something important, where there is ownership, where they feel positive about being in this space? That's the only way you're going to get good customer service. You can't get it any other way. As long as people are disengaged from the organization, it's going to be very hard, unless someone now has their own internal motivation. And some people do. But if you want to really transform how employees interact with customers, you have to start internally. You have to do some self-awareness from an organizational perspective to understand, how are we creating an environment that will help our people to give out what they're getting. And when I engage with organizations, because we do a lot of that work, remember we said we work with teams, it's helping them to understand that it's not just salary, right? Yes, salary is important, but I know many organizations where people aren't necessarily paid the best, but their overall experience in work, starting with how the boss talks to you and engages with you, is positive. And so they have a positive vibe, and they're more willing to engage with customers positively.
And when was the last time you like were at a government office, and how was the user experience there?
So I've not recently been in a government office here in Zim, to be honest.
Passport office, nothing.
No, I haven't. Not recently. I try and avoid those places because user experience is usually really bad, to be honest. Actually, no, that's not true. I went to some offices recently. I had to drop off an envelope for someone, actually.
A brown envelope.
No, not that kind of envelope. Some documents. And I actually even commended the security
All right.
as you're walking in. So it's the Ministry of Justice and Parliamentary Affairs. I'm even going to say it because I was so impressed.
All right.
So this is a big shout out. I wish I had I wish I remembered her name because I asked her so I could even give her a personal shout out. But you know where you're signing in with your ID? She was awesome. She had a smile on her face. How are you doing today? And then there was a bit of a queue and they had two people. So she's like, oh, you know what? Then we can move through quickly. I was just like, she was awesome. Just signing in ID, filling your ID number and everything. So that's probably the most recent experience. And it was actually quite positive. But unfortunately, usually...
Yeah, especially with guards. Especially, especially with guards. You know the ones who join city, they act like they own the city.
Yeah.
Like, especially with guards, I don't know what's it with guards. They just don't feel like they came to work if they don't have a problem with someone. And
but you know what? This goes back to the employer, right? And are you creating, is it important? Is it a priority to create an environment where you make them understand how important their role is?
not true. You're very right, because I would also be grumpy the whole day if I was delivered to work in a T35. So tell us, what are you working on currently? What's your company doing across the globe currently? And what are you looking forward to? What are you excited about? What would you like our viewers to know?
So, I mean, working on a number of things. So we work with leaders across Africa to help them really understand their teams, to really build their leadership competence so they can drive sustainable performance. What we know is when people feel good, they do good. So how can we create that environment? How can we build that psychological safety? So we have a number of clients across Africa where we support their leadership teams. So we run leadership development programs. And the most successful ones are ones where we work with an organization long term. So not just we've done a half-day training on leadership, but we're walking with a team. And we have a number of clients that we're doing that with. Really excited that now we're working with clients from, as much as they're working with their teams in Africa, they're clients from the US, clients from Europe, with teams, organizations that have teams in Africa. So that's some of the work that's really exciting for me, because it means that we're not just doing like a quick hit. We're really supporting leaders to change, which is really what I'm passionate about. We also working with organizations. We have an annual mental health conference because, again, what we realize is part of this cultivating psychological safety is being mindful of the mental health of teams. And so we have our annual mental health conference, and something I'm really excited about is we're talking about, so it's in Nairobi every year. And something I'm excited about is we're going to be, bringing one to the southern part of the world. We'll be doing one in Johannesburg. So that's something to watch out for, but that will be next year. So I'm excited. That's very early conversations about that, but that will happen. So that's really to provide a space to talk about mental health and what it means and how we can support each other preventatively, because again, toxic workplaces trigger mental health challenges. So how can we create that psychological safety so we can prevent some of that? Also doing a bit of work online, developed programs online, really excited about. One of my passions is supporting African women in leadership. So we have a program in the pipeline that we're going to be launching online, specifically targeted towards supporting, women. And then I have my podcast, EQ at Work.
Oh yeah, so I went through about 3 episodes.
Yes.
I like the one where you're talking about peeling layers. I think.
Yes.
That episode.
Yeah. So there's EQ at Work podcast. So that's something that people can follow. I talk about emotional intelligence. Again, it's, this season's geared towards professional African women. My kids tell me I'm biased. I'm a mother of boys, and they always tell me, "Mommy, but you like girls too much. You do things for girls." But I think I like to speak from my experience and speak about what I know. So that's also something that I'm really excited about doing.
You mentioned something about mental health, and I wanted to ask, how do we draw the line between people who are genuinely having mental health issues and depressed, and people who are just having a bad day? Because life will throw you lemons at times.
Yeah.
So it's like really a thin line. How do you differentiate that? You said you got a 16-year-old son. I mean, son, girls will break your heart. Hear it from me. Your mom will tell you this.
For sure.
And so how do you then conjure the emotional intelligence without compromising their mental health? Like, how do we deal with that? Because it seems now the line is getting a bit blurry, whereby it's like, this life, how do we navigate that space?
I mean, I think the only way to really navigate that, and this is why I say that we're really big on preventative measures, right? So the only way to do that is to support individuals to build greater resilience, right? Resilience to navigate those times where the hard knocks that life will throw at you. And I think within a work environment, it's really important to work with your teams. Resilience is such a critical skill now because life is hard, life is challenging, and not everyone is naturally resilient. But the beauty is it's a skill that we can develop, right? So I think looking at it from a leadership perspective, answering your question, number one, support your team to build greater resilience so that they are able to navigate. Number two, as a leader, you need to invest in your understanding of mental health so that you can learn to differentiate, because there'll also be people who want to take advantage, right? And take advantage of maybe policies that you may introduce around mental health. So as a leader, you need to become knowledgeable about mental health. And then you need to employ people who are mental health practitioners who can support to be able to navigate that gray area. I think that's really important. But I think leaders need to have an understanding. And then you need to just have mental health initiatives and mental health awareness so that people themselves know, right, that, okay, this is just a bad day. And it's okay for me to kind of throw a pity party for a bit, but then I need to get back to work, right? And you know what? This bad day has been consistent for too long. I think I need to maybe get a bit of help.
Or I need to get a job, but okay.
Yeah, true.
I mean, before you go any further, you've already pitched it already. You've already told the leaders to get people who actually are mental health practitioners.
Yeah.
So where can they actually hire you? And just look into the camera and give us the way they can contact you at.
Sure. So you can find me online. I'm available on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever you prefer. My personal handle is at Mucha Mlingo, so pretty straightforward. We have a website as an organization, www.pts, that's Papa Tango Sierra.co.ke, and you can find us there. Online as an organization, we are at PTS Africa. So across all the different platforms, that is our social media handle. So you can get in touch with us and we can have a conversation about supporting your leaders and your teams to be able to thrive at work. And ultimately, this will help to drive performance. So get in touch.
So speaking of emotional intelligence, there's been there's been an increase in the divorce rate in this country globally, right? What's going on there, like emotionally? Is it an emotional thing? Is it an emotional intelligence thing? What's going on? Why are marriages breaking down? Why are our men committing suicide? What's happening in that landscape?
So let's start with the last thing you said about the men committing suicide. Right. I think that the challenge we have, and this is prevalent across the African continent, is that we have raised boys and we've told them they need to be strong. We've told them that they can't cry. We've told them that they need to man up. And what we've done, maybe unintentionally so, in our desire to have strong men, is we've told men that they need to bottle up what they're feeling. But remember, emotions drive behavior, right? Not only is there a higher incidence of suicide in men, and it's growing in numbers, but even mental health challenges, because men just don't have an outlet. They don't feel that they can talk about what they're going through. They feel that if they talk about what they're going through, it's a sign of weakness. And so they believe that they must do it all on their own. We had an amazing conference this year, mental health conference, and we had two men on the panel where we were talking about navigating mental health. And this is the story over and over, that we're raised to think that we cannot show any weakness. And what that's done is, where else do I go? And so I feel like I can't go anywhere. And so the only solution is to kill myself.
And it's interesting when you say that, because even if, let's say, you got your partner or whatever, the minute you say, you know what, I'm going through this and I'm worried about this and whatever, right? It's cool, yes, she can be accepting that. But most guys I've talked to, they'll probably tell you that you can tell her that and be vulnerable to her. And then, yes, at that time when things are cool, she's really accepting whatever. In the back of the mind, she's actually loading artillery and ammunition to say, whenever you guys get in an argument, she'll pull that and blow it up in your face. And then people wonder, why don't men actually talk about it? And
I think it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. Now, I mean, what you've shared, I think, speaks to two things. Firstly, I think men need to be a bit wiser about their choice of women, right? Because a true woman isn't going to load her artillery gun. She's going to allow you to be vulnerable and it's a good thing, right? And recognize that marriage is meant to create a safe space. I mean, if you can't talk to your wife about what you're going through, who the heck can you talk to, right? Because men are less likely to go and find a therapist. They're less likely to talk to their pastor. I mean, maybe they'll joke about it with their boys, but with their boys, it's just going to be like a joke. It's not like, seriously, I'm going through stuff. And yet, if you have a relationship with your wife where you can tell her that, oh my goodness, my boss is just on my last nerve and I feel like I'm just going to scream, that should be a safe space, right? So I think men need to be a bit more wise about how they choose spouses and stop just looking at the outside and focus on the whole person. And, just take time to get to know, is this someone I can truly be safe with? And I think it works both ways. Too many relationships are superficial. If I don't know myself, there's no way you're going to know me.
True.
Too many relationships are superficial. And this then speaks to the conversation about divorce. We don't know ourselves, which means we don't really know each other. True. Now you're in that home and there's elements of each other that are coming out and you're just like, what? Who is this person? Right? So I think, and then I also think that perhaps we get married for the wrong reasons. We get married for the dress. We get married for the day. We get married because all your boys have gotten married. And I think all of that has contributed to rising divorce rates. So, I mean, I think emotional intelligence has a play in the sense that, emotional intelligence helps us to not just make emotional decisions, to think longer term, to recognize that love is not a feeling. Love is a decision. And that decision should help me navigate even the rough patches, right? The times where I don't feel like I love you, but I made a decision, I made a commitment. And that's what emotional intelligence is about. It's about, yes, this is how I feel, but how am I going to use that appropriately? Remember, I said emotions are data, but they're not directives. I think sometimes we're a little impatient. We saw this Hollywood idea of what marriage is. And when we get into it, we realize that it's not quite what I was sold on the tin. Now, I mean, there are some dysfunctions that maybe can't be dealt with. But I have found that there are instances where maybe we could have just taken a little more time to get to know ourselves better before we dive into being with somebody else. Yeah.
How complex is the work of getting to know yourself and getting to and peeling away all the layers? I mean, I recently, I think by the time this episode probably comes out, I'll be like 3 years sober. I really looked at myself in the mirror and I was like, yo, and then did the work. And I've still, because it's a continuous journey. How hard and how complex is doing the work on yourself to get to know yourself? Because I then realized as well, like, just as I was going about it, that it's crazy that we go through our lives as imitations or projections of other people's dreams, other people's expectations and stuff. And then you then get to a point where, the funny thing is crazy. I always tell people that, like, it was at 32 that I was like, hold up, who is this person?
Yeah.
And then you start getting to know yourself from. So, like, how important and how complicated is that process?
So it is critical, I think, absolutely critical. Um, and you know what you say in your 30s, but it's a good thing that in your 30s you came to that. There are people who are way older who still have no understanding of the depth of themselves. So it's important, critical to my thinking. And you know what? It's one of those things that's both simple and complicated at the same time, right? It's simple in the sense that you could start simply with every day, at the end of your day, spend 15 minutes just reflecting on the day. Just reflect on how you navigated the day, how you responded to the things that happened to you, how you answered this individual, how you handled your child's outburst, how you dealt with the person who cut you up in the line. Like, just think through. And if you do that consistently over time, you start to notice patterns. And you start to notice patterns that are maybe not serving you well. So it can start as simple as that. But it's also complex because when we want to get to know ourselves, we're talking about getting down to the root, right? Peeling back the layers. And that then requires some intentionality, right? So really taking time to think about your upbringing and how your upbringing shaped you. What are some of the things that you went through? There's a really great exercise that you can do. You can Google it online. It's called the River of Life exercise, that just walks you through or helps you to reflect on, the journey of life. You see life as a river. And what were some of the turns? What were some of the pivotal moments? And how have they affected you? How have they shaped you? Those of us who've suffered traumas of some sort, whether it's divorce or a parent dying or a sibling dying or an accident that was, physically debilitating, or just being raised by parents where there was abuse, whether it's emotionally or physically. You are definitely affected by that. There's no doubt about it. So you have to go back, and it's uncomfortable. It's messy because you're looking at yourself in the mirror, like you say, and sometimes you don't like what you see. You don't like the decisions. But I think for me, I always say that I went on my EQ journey and I became a certified EQ practitioner for my clients' benefit. I thought I was doing it for others, but I have been the biggest beneficiary. It's been an amazing experience, but somewhat uncomfortable. Really looking back and recognizing that, okay, because of the out of controlness of my upbringing at some season when my parents got divorced, and in the years coming up to it, because they didn't have the healthiest of marriages, right? And I can speak about it openly now. Recognizing that because of that, there's some things that I do. And here's the thing, you can recognize it and still find yourself doing the same thing, right? So there is a lot of work, but it's such rewarding work. It means that you live life fully, you live life as God intended us to live it. Too many of us are living life very superficially. And that's not what God intends. The Bible says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Many of us, we're not living in abundance. And that abundance is not about wealth, right? Financial wealth. I mean, that's a good thing. But that abundance is about an abundance of living because of the authenticness of your living. And you can only have that authenticity if you've done the work of, peeling back the layers. And then as you know this information, then make different decisions. Because if you still make the same decisions, nothing's going to change, right? Like the saying goes, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So I now have to then make those changes. So, for example, becoming a recovering shoutaholic. For example, recognizing that when my sons push back and I'm feeling a little out of control, it's not disrespect. It's because they want to express themselves. And I like that. So how do I respond in such a way that I cultivate that? Recognize that, as a leader, how am I creating that psychological safety? What are some of the things that I do unknowingly that undermine psychological safety? So to answer your question, it's both easy and hard, but it's essential.
And we've got people watching. We've got like young girls watching. The young girls will come after us, will watch this. What advice can you give to a young girl who just finished high school, about to get to university? What life advice can you give to that young person?
Be kind to yourself. we're hard on ourselves. I think that, especially as women, there are all these expectations, and we've been raised to believe that we can kind of have the world, right? And so because we can have the world, we push ourselves really hard, and I think sometimes we're really unkind to ourselves. So I think the advice I would give a young woman, listening, is be kind to yourself, monitor your self-talk, pay attention. For me, everything always comes back to self-awareness. Pay attention to what you're saying to yourself, because here's the thing, you are what you think you are. And if you keep telling yourself, subconsciously, it ends up undermining the efforts that you're making. So be kind to yourself, pay attention to what you're telling yourself, develop a habit of positive self-talk, catch yourself. We have a tendency of saying, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I'm not smart enough. And that's a record that's playing in our minds. So I would say, pay attention to that. Listen to what you're saying to yourself and stop yourself from saying it, and replace it with positive affirmations, because that will really help you to navigate life more effectively. And then I think, don't wear a face. Be your authentic self. Be your authentic self. I think that is so important. Life is too short to live it as someone else.
And so tell me, what's your favorite Kenyan dish? What's your favorite Zimbabwean dish? And what's your favorite British dish?
My favorite, I don't know if it's a British dish, but I love jacket potatoes. Like,
All right.
oh my goodness, I love jacket potatoes smothered with butter and cheese. And I also really like salmon. So I think those would be my kind of European favorites. In Kenya, I would say chapati. That's like a family favorite. We love chapati. And for me, chapati with stew, that's my Kenyan favorite. Zimbabwean favorite dish. You know what? I mean, I really like the way that we do our kind of sadzane with the nyama and the veggies. That traditional.
It's called haifirit.
That traditional. But then I also really love how we do oxtail.
All right.
Right. I've never eaten oxtail outside of either Zimbabwe or outside of Zimbabweans cooking it as good as the Zimbabwean oxtail. And oxtail goes down with sadzane veg. Oh, goodness, yes.
And what are the 3 things that you love about this country?
One of them is I just love being in a place where, I'm not foreign. So I love being home. You know what I mean? I love the fact that I can hear what people are saying. I understand the language, not in the minority. Yeah, so I love that about home. I love certain foods about home, things that you can't get elsewhere. Majanje, cherry plum, masawa, stuff like that. I love Zimbabwean people. I mean, I think we're really resilient. I think that, often life has knocked us, but we're really resilient. We're really warm. We're really welcoming. I think I love that about Zimbabwean people. And then I love the country. The country is beautiful. We've got some amazing places. Eastern Highlands, Victoria Falls, that's just to name a few that are really beautiful. And I love visiting them. I'm an outdoor person. I love nature. So I love being, in nature. This weekend we're going to Inyanga and I can't wait. So I think I love that about Zim as well.
Mucha Mlingo, thanks a lot for coming through and, trying to just, reach our emotional intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, if you were offended, it's cool. We did a great job. If you were inspired and got to thinking, that was an intention. This has been The Bold Exchange. See you next week with another episode out.